I died here in Jacksonville. I went on to become governor of Florida, and I was the very first governor of Florida who was actually born in Florida. Now, unfortunately, my legacy has all been forgotten. And as we walk around, I will tell you a little bit of my story, as well a little bit of my family story. But I have essentially been forgotten. Now, and that is why I walk the streets today. Now, in 1845, when I entered politics, a poem appeared in the local newspaper. Started like this. Once upon a midnight dreary.
While I pondered, weak and weary over many a quite too curious volume of forgotten lore. While I nodded, nearly napping, and suddenly there came a tapping, as if someone gently rapping at my chamber door. "'Tis some visitor," I muttered, tapping at my chamber door, "only this, and nothing more." Now that I remember, it was in the bleak December, each desperate dying ember rocked its ghost upon the floor. Eagerly I sought the morrow, vainly I had hoped to borrow from my books surcease of sorrow. Sorrow for the lost Lenore, the rare and radiant maiden whom the ages named Lenore, who shall be nameless nevermore.
Edgar Allan Poe himself, the Raven. Follow me this way. My story is about the second story of the building right here on the corner. That's where Cook's Cabinet Shop was. In 1923, Dr. Ralph Green was basically hired by the state of Florida to devise this particular instrument. Well, he decided he wouldn't tell anybody about it because he needed some help creating this particular instrument. So the first thing he needed was a carpenter, basically, to build him a chair. And he contacted Mr. Cook up there on the second floor. And Mr. Cook had worked with Dr. Green before, and Dr. Green had worked with him before to create different furniture pieces for a hospital at one time. So it wasn't that much of a difference to Mr. Cook, but this particular chair that he was building had very odd dimensions to it. Very wide seat, a very tall back to it. And the legs was two big thick legs in the back and one big giant thick leg in the front with a footrest. Well, Mr. Cook had built that chair for Dr. Green, and then Dr. Green took it on up to his house up in Springfield, just to the north here. And he finished it off, putting the necessary straps onto it and the electrodes. And what he had made was Old Sparky, Florida's first and only electric chair that was used for 75 years electrocuting people.
Right there?
Well, Mr. Cook had no idea what he had contributed to. So every time somebody was electrocuted, he felt it. He felt it. And he ended up going insane. And he died in an insane asylum. So it's his figure, John Cook, that we see up on the second floor today at night. Follow me this way. Very horrific day in Jacksonville's history. It was May 3rd, 1901, when a fire starts at the Cleveland Fiber Factory. Used to process the Spanish moss back in the day, stuff upholstery with it. Well, it's a dry, windy day in Jacksonville when the outside drying rack caught fire, and the fire jumps to the factory itself, and the roof collapses on that factory, and all the hot embers blow up into the air. The fire started to the west, and the wind was blowing to the east. And right in the corner where we just cut through was where the Mohawk building was. It was a brand new building. It was fireproof. And when that fire broke out, people thought they would be safe in the new Mohawk building. So many people gathered inside the Mohawk building. But then the wind changed direction and it blew this way to the south. And those people in that Mohawk building were cut off. There was only one way for them to escape. It was to come this way to the south, down Market Street, down here to the Market Street Pier. So they came down here to the pier and the flames followed them down here. So they were screaming for help. There was a boat that came. Arthur Cummer had a yacht, rescued people, but could not rescue everyone. So the screams were going on for people looking to be rescued. People drowned here right at this very spot. And that's why this monument is here today, because this is where most of the people died during the Great Fire of 1901. And it's late at night. You can still hear screams coming off of the river. This way. Jacksonville has suffered through several epidemics. Yellow fever epidemics. And on this particular day in 1854, was the start of the scarlet fever epidemic. You see, Mrs. Turknett used to watch a young girl named Allie Dell. Dr. Dell put Mrs. Turknett in charge of his only daughter. Mrs. Turknett took very good care of Allie, and they would play down here back in the day because there was sand dunes over here. Well, on this one particular day, Allie got a little bit too close to the sailors that had come in, and she caught the fever. She had caught the scarlet fever. Well, Mrs. Turknett, she was beside herself, as you can imagine. It was her job to protect young Allie. So she did her best to nurse Allie, holding her day and night, but Allie did succumb to the fever. Mrs. Turknett had gone home and she had taken her clothes and hung them up in her closet. Well, a month later, she put those same clothes back on, and in her house, with her 5 boys, they all caught the fever and they all died within an 8-day period. All the Turknett boys all died. Now, when this tour is finished with the walking tour, if anybody wants to go with me to see the Turknett graves and any others, up at the 1852 cemetery, that's a mile from here, you're welcome to join me up there as well. I'll give you the address. But that's one of the sites at the cemetery, is to go to the Turknett graves, all side by side. So, poor Miss Turknett, she did her best with young Allie, and Allie's ghost has been seen, small white girl, waving to boats down here. But anytime you saw Allie, if you look in the distance right behind her, you saw another dark shadow, Mrs. Turknett. She's never left Allie's side. Follow me this way. My father, Isaiah Hart, who lays out the city, the original 20 blocks of Jacksonville, all in here. You won't see a sign around where my father's house was, any of that. Part of that disrespect that has continued through the years. Now, what the early founders had done was give the land on the outskirts of town to the Episcopal community. So they gave the land up on Billy Goat Hill, up to the north, on the outskirts of town, to the Episcopal church community. Now, why would the church community want the land up on the hill? Well, when you're on a hill like that, and you go to bury one of your loved ones, you'd bury them around the church. Well, if you're on a hill, you could dig down a little bit right there, not hit water. So that was prime property for the church up on the hill. Now, back in my day, when someone had passed, you could pay your respects to that family because the body was basically laid out in the front room of the house when you first entered the house, that very first room, and it became known as the dead room. So you paid your respects to that family there, and then that night, the body, we'd take it and move it on up to the church, where it would be buried the next day. Now, just in case someone stayed up to watch that body throughout the night, just in case it was to move or anything, we want to make sure that person is dead. So the person who was in charge of watching the body worked the graveyard shift. And sometimes we put a bell on their foot or on their hand, because then they could be saved by the bell. Now the next day there would be a funeral service, and then we would bury that body up around there. Now at some point in time, somebody decided that name of that front room, dead room, was just a little bit too morbid, and they changed it to the living room. Now, if all the graves were all around the church up there, well, what happened when the streets expanded north? Well, now those horses and carriages are going over top of those stones, those gravestones. So it was time then for the very first public cemetery in Jacksonville. So in 1852, we started the city cemetery. Today we call it Old City Cemetery. So, 1852, we start City Cemetery, and we take those headstones around the church, and we move them over to Old City Cemetery. But we didn't move the bodies. So the bodies are still up there. There's a poltergeist going on up there. If anybody knows, on the west or the east side of the church, there's townhomes right there, built over top of the graveyard right there. Yeah, real nice. They didn't tell them this way. Is our Florida Theater building, always listed as one of the top haunted places in Jacksonville. This is where the old jail was on this location. Then this building got built in the 1920s. Has anyone ever been inside and sat in one of the ghost seats? Because there are known ghost seats here. So there are several known ghosts in here inside this building. One is Mr. Joseph Hilton, and his room that he likes to be in and doesn't want anyone to disrespect it or anything is the projection room. See, he was the original projectionist. And when this was built in the silent movie days, he saw this right into the talkies before he died, and then he just decided to stay around. Now there was a little girl who fell from the balcony. Her name was Susie. She is one of the local ghosts who just remains, as well as her mom Goldie is always close by. But not that long ago, they had refurbished this theater, switched out all the seats, put in all new seats, except for the ghost seats. They kept the ghost seats back to the original seats just the way they were. So you're welcome when you go in and you get tickets for a show or anything to request a ghost seat. And don't be surprised if you get taps on the shoulder and such, because you are sitting in one of the ghost seats. Follow me this way. So my father, Isaiah Hart, city founder, names a lot of the streets. Named a street after my sister Laura. That's why a couple of blocks from here there's Laura Street. I have another sister named Julia. So another street named after my sister Julia. Well, no street named after me, Ossian Hart. I spelled my name O-S-S-I-A-N. No street named after me. Look at the name of the street here. Ocean Street. There is no ocean anywhere near here. Once again, I've been disrespected. Not only have I been forgotten, but I've been disrespected as my family as well. Because we had a family mausoleum in this area. It was desecrated. So all of us were relocated up to Evergreen Cemetery. Follow me this way. Building right here on this corner that is a very cursed building here in Jacksonville. Some people know it as the Bostwick building. Now when it was first built, it was the first national bank. But the first national bank didn't last very long. Within 2 years, they had gone out of business. The next bank to take over that building was the Guarantee Savings and Loan. It only lasted a couple of years before that one went out of business. The next bank to move in was the Brotherhood State Bank. And they were doing pretty good for a number of years. And their head teller was Mr. Thomas Hendricks. And Thomas Hendricks would come out to this very spot every day for his smoking break. And people to this day do smell cigarette smoke back here that just seems to come out of nowheres. Well, Mr. Thomas Hendricks come back here every day. During his break, he would smoke his cigarettes. But on this one particular day, he went back into his office in the bank. He closed his door. He locked his door. He was the head teller. He locked his door, sat at his desk. He pulled out a revolver from his desk drawer and he shot himself in the head. Well, you can imagine the commotion in the lobby of the bank, hearing this loud noise, not knowing what it was, until the blood curdled out from underneath his office door and out into the lobby of the bank. The bank never reopened. It closed and never reopened. So that building has a curse tied to it. And now today, that building is the Cowford Chop House. And I warned them of the curse of this particular building. So I said they needed to do something. Needed to do something to honor Mr. Thomas Hendricks. Perhaps have a dessert for him. Call it a blood pudding. Watch your step. Lynch building here, built in the 1920s. It's a residential building today, and the people find it very odd that the elevators all have a mind of their own. See, when you go into the elevator and you press a button, it doesn't necessarily go to that floor that you press. It goes to whatever floor that ghost wants it to go to. So, people complain about that. Maintenance has looked at it, but it has nothing to do with basically it being mechanically wrong at all. So Mr. Lynch had built this building, and he was proud of building this building at 17 stories high, and he put advertisements everywhere that he was building the tallest building in Florida. He was so proud of this going up in the 1920s. And see, the Barnett family had kept it quiet, their new headquarter building that they had started. So just when he finished it at 17 stories high, the Barnett family announced that they were building their building 18 stories high, finished the next month. So he never really had the tallest building in Florida at all. Is he the one haunting it? I do not know. But Mr. Lynch was quite upset that he never got a chance to have the tallest building. Now, what was here before this building? Before this building, there were houses that were here. In the 1870s, there was a guy that lived here named John Swain. And John Swain had a different name in Texas because that was his alias here in Jacksonville. He was very well known in Texas. His name was John Wesley Hardin. If anybody knows, watches the History Channel, knows anything about Texas history, he is the most notorious criminal in Texas history. He's known to have killed 42 men. He was in 19 gunfights. Well, he left Texas to keep from being put in jail. He was kept being chased by the Pinkerton detectives. So he changed his name to John Swain, and he lived right where this building is. He lived right here in the 1870s. And you see, I looked him up in the city census, because it still survives. And it says, John Swain, his name. It lists the occupants in the house. His wife and his son were here as well. Puts his address right at this very spot, and then lists his occupation. He listed his occupation as butcher. This particular building was built in the 1920s, but come 1963 it had changed names, and it was the Roosevelt Hotel. And it is where the most tragic event in Jacksonville's history took place, in the middle of the night. You see, it was Gator Bowl weekend, which is the most popular weekend in Jacksonville, 1963. Famous guests were even staying in the Roosevelt Hotel there. A basketball player named Norm Sloan was there. There was a lady named Donna Axion, who was the Miss America, who was staying in that hotel on that night. Well, in the middle of the night, a fire starts in the basement, the bottom of the hotel there. Now, it wasn't the type of fire where you saw lots of flames, but it was this mysterious fire that started. It was creating this suffocating black smoke. And see, it slowly in the middle of the night started billowing up. Now, the people started smelling it on the second floor, but it was so thick and so suffocating they couldn't go down through the smoke. So they just went up higher. Trying to wake other people up, everyone just kept going higher and higher and higher till they got up to the rooftop. And see, the Navy was called, and the Navy came in with helicopters and rescued people from the rooftop. But see, not everyone made it out of their rooms. So, of course, the fire department came, onlookers came. This was a big deal in Jacksonville. You can imagine all the people coming around to see what they could do to help. But you see, the firemen with their ladders couldn't reach up to the upper floors. So what was happening was the people that was in that room, they were trying to stuff towels underneath their door to keep that smoke from coming in. But it still just came right in, that suffocating black smoke. So they opened up their windows to get fresh air. But see, that smoke just kept coming into the room, kept coming into the room. It was so suffocating that they would take bed sheets, tie it to furniture, and they were hanging out their windows. But they could only hold it for so long before they dropped to their death. Very, very horrific to watch all of these onlookers looking on that day and seeing people one by one drop from the bed sheets down onto the ground. 22 people died that night. So those that live in that residential complex, well, in the middle of the night, they hear people running in the hallways. They do hear screams for help inside that building. Follow me this way. Two big underground vaults underneath it. And see, one time I was underneath this building with a group of photographers. And I had taken them in specially. They wanted to take pictures of the underground vaults. And when we were down underground, noticed on the floor there was little tiny pieces of like white paper. Almost looked like petals of a flower. Little tiny piece of white paper all over the place down there. Didn't think anything of it till I found the article that it happened in 1979, the Valentine's Day murder that took place here. So Mr. Prentice O'Neill Murphy came here on Valentine's Day with white roses for his wife. And he entered into the bank, and they were used to seeing him, the employees were, and they informed him that his wife was downstairs. So he went to deliver her the roses. So he gave her the white roses, and then he pulled out a pistol from his pocket and shot her in the head 3 times. So what is that still down there, those petals? Perhaps those are petals from the white roses. This way. This way is no ordinary alleyway. There's actually a tunnel underneath here. And that tunnel now has been covered over. If you were down underground and you looked up, while being in that tunnel, you would see a glass ceiling. Very thick glass. Because back in the early days with the banks, how they lit up the tunnels was they installed a very thick glass as a ceiling, so that the sun could shine in, light up the tunnel down there. But it was so thick that you couldn't see what was going on down there. But we are between the banks here. There's all underground tunnels around us. So on this one particular day, I had a helper down cleaning up one of the old vaults underneath this building here. And I told the guy that I was working with, I said, there's another building to the north. And I know it was owned by the same bank, and I know there's a tunnel that connects those 2 buildings. I just don't know where that tunnel goes. So this is what I'm gonna do. I'm gonna go around up on Adams Street. I'm gonna go down into the Adams Street side, a block from here. And I got my baseball bat, and I'm gonna bang on the door over there. And you tell me where the noise is coming from on this side, and we'll find that tunnel. And we'll figure out how the banks were connected, how the buildings were connected. So that's what I did. Bang, bang, bang. And I came around, and he says, I know where you were. So the room, the whole tunnel area there was all filled with garbage. So we had to climb over things to figure out which door I was banging on from this side. And it led us into this tunnel here. So we walked to the north inside this tunnel up towards Adams Street. But once again, we were climbing over top of things. And we got to the door where I was on the other side before. We saw a little makeshift shrine right there. There was a pocket watch, big giant pocket watch. There was a cross, a little tiny cross, and there was an old photograph with a woman in the photograph, very old black and white photograph. 3 things, little shrine was placed right there. So we felt like we didn't want to disrespect it or anything. We felt like we should just leave that right there the way it was. And we had more work to do, so we climbed back out of the tunnel. Continued our work. At the end of the day, we left, and we told the security guard that we found this little shrine at the end of this tunnel that no one's been into. So the security guard said, well, tomorrow when you come back, show it to me. We said, okay. So the next day, we were there with our flashlights, took the security guard in there, once again, climbed over all the top of the stuff. When we got to where the little shrine was, it wasn't there anymore. It was gone. This way. Things here. Of course, we had already talked about the Florida National Bank. The building to the left is the Florida Life Insurance Building. And notice what's up at the top of that building. See that little structure on the top of that high rise? Over there just to behind the bank building, a little bit to the left. That was a little penthouse for Mr. Bernard Burney. He had a restaurant on the corner where the Elks building is, the next corner going up, the brown stone building up there. That's where his restaurant was. And he was called the Man in Green. And every day was St. Patrick's Day in his restaurant. Everything was green. He was actually in a comic strip, one of those strips with in a newspaper with Ripley's Believe It or Not, because every day was St. Patrick's Day. Well, Bernie worked every single day of his life in that restaurant. And when he finished at the end of the day, he would go up to the top story up there, and that was his penthouse up there. So people downtown have looked up and saw someone up there looking down at them. They've seen a figure up there at the top of that building. And I'm sure it was Bernie, because that was his penthouse. That was just a small little apartment that he had up there for just him and his dog, Peggy. Follow me this way. Nobody knows the name of that street, one block over to the west? This is Laura, one over is...
Hogan?
Hogan, yes, Hogan.
Cheated.
Now poor Mr. Hogan's, he is one of the people who is been disrespected as well. See, he spelled his name with an S. That's why there's Hogan's Creek. But we have a Hogan Street where his house was. But they spelled his name wrong. Perhaps the most bizarre story I'm going to tell tonight. It's about the third floor of this building. This building is called the Drew Building. And as a historian, I study the history of Jacksonville. And the Drew family is one of the oldest families in Jacksonville. And when you trace all the different fires that took place in Jacksonville, it always seemed like the Drew Building would burn. It'd get rebuilt and it would burn again. Well, in 1901, the whole city burned, including the Drew Building. So this building here gets built. It is the new Drew Building in 1903, built right after the fire. So it was built as a two-story building. Built as a two-story building. And the Drew family had this for their print shop. And they hired an architect, famous architect in Jacksonville's history, Henry John Clutho, to put a third story onto this building. And he started the project and he stopped. He walked away from it. The only project Henry John Clutho ever walked away from was putting a third story onto this building. Swore he couldn't do it. Moved on to another project. Well, this guy Camps took over that project. They hired another architect to do it. Camps put on the third story, and no more than when the third story was built, it collapsed and people died.
Wow.
So, something's going on with the third story in this building. Now, they eventually did put a third story on. And our most famous arsonist and serial killer in Jacksonville was Otis Toole. Anyone ever hear of Otis Toole? He lived up in Springfield, started several fires in Springfield and all. His most famous murder was of a young boy named Adam Walsh. And Adam Walsh's father, John Walsh, started a crime show. America's Most Wanted. Yeah, that was John Walsh after his son Adam was abducted and killed by Otis Toole. Well, Otis Toole only started one fire in downtown Jacksonville on the third story of this building. And Otis Toole swore that he heard voices. He heard voices telling him what to do. So once again, the third story. No one goes up on the third story. They can never keep a tenant at all in there. So what's going on in this Drew building here? Well, once again, you have to go back to what was here before this building. And after our Civil War, this is where the Freedmen's Bank building was built. And the Freedmen's Bank building, unfortunately, went out of business. People all lost their money who invested in the Freedmen's Bank. But this building was unoccupied, and on the third floor became the new courtroom. They used the third floor for the courtroom. So, on this one particular day, in the late 1800s, it's our version of the Lizzie Borden story. Familiar with Lizzie Borden? Had an axe, right? Gave her father 40 whacks. When she saw what she had done, gave her mother 41, right? Well, we had an axe murder that was the most sensational murder of its day in Jacksonville. It was up at the Fagan house up to the north. And on this particular day, Mr. and Mrs. Fagan came downtown to go shopping, and they left Mrs. Fagan's sister to watch their 2 young children. And when they had returned, they were all cut up with an axe. So you could imagine this being a very, very horrific thing in Jacksonville, and there was a lot of pressure on the police and the prosecutor and all to find who had done this. Well, the 2 people that they accused of this were the Scott brothers. And the Scott brothers were boarders at the Fagan house. So this really slick prosecuting attorney, he said it had to be this inside job. Of course, the brothers said, "What? We knew the family. We loved the family. Why would we do such a horrific thing to murder them?" But this prosecutor, he was good. He was good. And he tried to destroy what their alibi was and all, accused them of doing it. So they were accused and they were found guilty. And these 2 young men swore on that 3rd floor, they swore vengeance to that lead prosecutor because they knew they were going to be hung in the next few days. What was the name of the lead prosecutor? Drew. Same family. Drew. 3rd floor. Can't make it up. Can't make it up. Crazy. All right. Old City Brewery, 2 blocks this way. Need a beer, need a refill, whatever you need, use the restroom. I'll add